is lecture number 4, Old Imperialism and the Slave Trade in Africa. Much of modern African society was forever impacted by the slave trade. The slave trade had and continues to have an effect, not just on Africa, but on populations of people around the globe. The slave trade actually continues today within parts of Africa, believe it or not. Today there's quite a bit of human trafficking in certain war-torn nations. Children are most at risk. But there are also still cultural practices that include what Western nations refer to as enslavement. This is one of the many topics we will look at during this unit, as well as some of the things being done by the United Nations to address the modern effects of modern-day slavery. Well, between the 15 and 1800s, slave traders sent an estimated 10 to 15 million Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas as forced laborers for plantations. These plantations were located in the American colonies, as well as Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Caribbean and South America. Native populations had died off, and with native labor sources drying up, the European colonizers looked for a more suitable workforce. What resulted was a deadly commerce of human beings that forever changed the world. Europeans and Africans first made contact with one another in the 1400s, when Portuguese explorer Henry the Navigator attempted to find a way to India for trade. Prince Henry was one of the first Europeans to map the west coast of Africa and was intrigued by the gold there. Most European explorers during the 1500s were interested in 3 main things: God, gold, and glory. They wanted to spread Christianity, namely Catholicism. They were looking to strike it rich, and they wanted worldwide prestige or domination. European nation-states and monarchs were busy competing with one another for European and world domination, and that quest for glory often came at the expense of native populations in the places these rulers explored and conquered. West Africa was no exception. Gradually, other European explorers like Bartholomew Diaz, Columbus, and Vasco da Gama followed suit. The 1400s to 1500s marked a European era commonly referred to as the Age of Old Imperialism. As I said before, the primary motives during this time period included God, gold, and glory. Eventually, this old imperialism is going to result in the trade of human beings, also known as slavery. Initially, the European demand for slaves was quite limited. However, once territories were gained overseas, it became evident that a labor force was needed for plantation work. Colonists in the New World, and the New World was simply a term referring to the new territory in the Americas and Caribbean, by the way, had already depleted the native populations. Most Native American populations had been annihilated by European diseases like smallpox because they lacked immunity. In fact, that is how most people died. The Africans seemed, at the time, like a suitable choice because they sometimes already had immunity to these diseases, and it was thought that they could survive working in a tropical climate. It is important to note, however, that although Europeans adopted slavery during the 14 to 1500s, they certainly didn't create slavery. Slavery had long been practiced within Africa itself. Rival tribes in battle often forced the losers to become slaves. Sometimes Africans sold themselves or family members into slavery for survival during times of famine and hunger. In the video that we watched in class, we saw how even today there are slaves in different parts of Africa. This includes people who are considered servants in families. However, it was the Europeans who set up the Atlantic slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade was part of a triangular trade route set up in between the Americas, or New World, the Old World, or Europe, and Africa. This linkage of 3 continents ushered in the enslavement of human beings on a massive scale. Many Europeans viewed slaves as non-human, often relying on racist theories about differences between European and African peoples. Europeans enlisted the help of local African rulers to supply them with slaves. Europeans also attacked, or often attacked, coastal villages using guns and other weapons to enslave people. The journey across the Atlantic for slaves became known as the Middle Passage. Tightly packed ships were deplorably inhumane conditions resulted in many deaths. Most slaves didn't survive the Middle Passage. The end of slavery didn't officially end until 1807, after numerous abolition movements in Europe. Abolition is a word that means the movement to end slavery. Slavery continued in the U.S. until 1865, the end of the Civil War. The effects of the slave trade are still felt even today. Slave traders often took entire populations of the healthiest and most able people from villages, and this resulted in many villages simply disappearing. Although much of the slave trade occurred on the western part of the African continent, slavery also existed in East Africa. One particular East African leader named Mirambo, who ruled a kingdom called Nyamwezi in modern-day Tanzania, facilitated the slave trade by selling Africans to Europeans in exchange for guns. Other leaders in places like Congo engaged in similar practices. The result of the slave trade was that millions of people were displaced around the globe. Families and tribes, often whole clans, were separated from each other. There's actually a term for this displacement: diaspora or diaspora. Some people say diaspora, some people say diaspora, others diaspora. I think I'm pronouncing it how other people say it. But you can say diaspora. So what does this mean?
This next video is being made to address a gripe I've held on to for at least 5, maybe 6 years now. It involves my best friends and college roommates, Sam and Will. Fellas, remember in college at some point I was talking about the South Asian American experience? Which time? Hurry! Okay, it was the time I used the word diaspora, and you both jumped on me about it, and you said that the word was diaspora. And again, I said no, an alternate pronunciation is diaspora. And you said, no, you're wrong, it's diaspora. And I said, my mother uses the word diaspora. And you said, well, she's also wrong. And I realized it might be petty to you that I'm using public television in order to address this gripe, but I don't care. The word is diaspora because my mother says it's diaspora. And do you know why that matters? Because she was part of a diaspora. Therefore, by proxy, I can use the word diaspora and be right. Do you understand why you're wrong? You're wrong. I'll see you at the wedding.
It doesn't really matter how you pronounce it, but it means the scattering of people around the globe. Okay, so a diaspora means the scattering of people around the globe. Following the end of slavery in the U.S., many Africans returned to the continent and set up colonies to reestablish their African heritages. Examples of places where this occurred include the nations of Liberia and Sierra Leone. However, these free colonies were later negatively impacted by European imperialism in the late 1800s. This will lead to a conflict amongst opposing groups and tribes in these places and result in future civil wars, but more on that later. All right, so we've already learned that slavery in Africa, as well as the Atlantic slave trade, propagated primarily by the European desire for a cheap labor source in the New World colonies, and later propagated by the American colonies and then the U.S., will result in a mass displacement of African people around the globe. This diaspora forever changed the world. Imperialism is defined as many by the economic, political, or military domination of one nation by another nation for selfish motives or exploitation. I like to simplify this even more for students. It's basically when a bigger or stronger country takes over a smaller or weaker country to use the nation for its own purposes. We will talk about 2 types of imperialism during Unit 2, Old Imperialism and New Imperialism. I say 2 types because Europeans had different motives during different periods of time. Generally speaking, there are 2 primary eras of imperialism in the world, and yes, I know that we can easily argue that imperialism continues today in many forms, blah, blah, blah. But for our purposes today, we're going to refer to the 2 periods of time. So the age of old imperialism occurred primarily during the 14 and 1500s, during the European age of exploration. Europeans were primarily interested in North and South America as well as the Caribbean during this time period. This was also when the slave trade was established. The exploration of Africa starting in the 14 and 1500s was pretty limited, to tell you the truth, although European explorers had invented cool new technology that allowed them to explore further from home than ever before, using navigational tools like astrolabes and caravel ships. Their technology never really allowed them to get inside the African continent. Africa's national or natural geography really prohibited this from happening. Remember those escarpments? Yeah, well, Africa is pretty much a giant plateau rising up from the ocean floors, and its frequent cliff-like coastline doesn't possess a lot of natural harbor areas. Add to that the escarpments, those steep cliffs that divide the plateau parts of Africa from the flat coastal portion, and, it really makes it difficult to actually get into the continent in many places. And even river delta regions are difficult to navigate. European ships often encounter cataracts, or those series of waterfalls that made using river systems to penetrate the continent difficult as well. It won't be until the late 1800s, after the Industrial Revolution in Europe, with the creation of steam engines, steel, railroads, modern weaponry, that the Europeans will be able to navigate the continent. So, during the age of old imperialism, Europeans were involved in the slave trade and didn't really attempt to take over the African territories. The age of old imperialism officially ended in the mid-1700s once technology in Europe began to change, and this was on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. And this is going to usher in a period of new imperialism, which I'm going to talk more about in my next lecture. Thanks for listening. Bye.